From the CISO series, it's Cybersecurity Headlines.
A cyber attack on Iran's Natanz nuclear reactor. IcedID is taking over from Emotet, and the US and the UK now blame the Russian intelligence for the SolarWinds attack. These are just three of the stories that my colleagues and I have been bringing to you this week on the daily editions of the Cybersecurity Headlines podcast. And now we get a chance for some insight, some opinion, and some expertise and more from our guest, who this week is Davi Ottenheimer, VP of Trust and Digital Ethics at InRoute. So Davi, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Well, it's great. We had a lot of stuff to talk about today, and just before we get into it, I just want to remind everyone that our sponsor for this week's episode is Sonatype, and I'll be speaking to them very shortly, or speaking about them very shortly. And if you are joining us, consider joining us on Crowdcast as well. We just have plenty of space here for some comments and some insight from people watching as well. So we have just about 20 minutes now to go through these stories, and we're starting out with I guess one of the stories that started out this week here, which was Israel making a cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear facility. They confirmed that they were behind this cyber attack. And this is the Natanz reactor, which the Tehran has described as an act of terrorism, of course. But there were no censorship restrictions in this case. Mossad was given the credit for this. This is, I think, an interesting thing. So, Davi, my question to you is, this public admission, this openness here, which is very different from the Stuxnet days. What do you make of this?
Yeah, it is a change. It takes all the fun out of the attribution used to be the fun part, I thought, for me at least. In 2011, when we talked about Stuxnet, I gave a presentation called Dr. Stuxlove. And the change in attribution is obviously some sort of a purpose. I mean, there's a reason to not have attribution, to be hidden. There's a reason to have attribution, and I think it's clearly political. So I think Israel's trying to play its card and be known. But really, it's also interesting that this is nothing new in terms of technique. I'm destroying electricity. Supply chain electricity goes back to the 90s. We saw mainframes destroying their electricity and all sorts of problems back then. I dealt with some of those personally. But what's different is here that, they used software last time. This is far less of a cyber attack than it is kinetic or physical attack. And they did quite a bit of damage to the facility. So it's a cat and mouse game, and they went for the electrical, taking on the supply chain. So that's actually sort of interesting because it's old, but it's new.
Yeah, it's cat and mouse, but a little bit less cloak and dagger in the sense that they're being open about this. Not just an interesting political maneuvering, especially with, of course, the new administration here taking over the responsibility of peace and diplomacy or otherwise. So, with that as a related concept, and the other story I've been looking at in the same way more recently now is about the US and the UK, who are now blaming Russian intelligence for the SolarWinds attack. They pinned the SolarWinds attack on their intelligence service. This was an advisory that was just posted today. And it's urging organizations to patch the top 5 publicly known VPN and cloud vulnerabilities that are being exploited by Cozy Bear, their APT threat actor. This is largely in VPNs like Fortinet, Cinecore, and a few others like that. And at the same time, President Biden has issued new sanctions, expelling 10 diplomats, and the Kremlin is threatening to retaliate for what it calls illegal sanctions. So once again, is this kind of a surprise? Is this accurate as a technical thing, or is this more of a political posturing as well, if posturing is the right word?
I think everything is political in some sense. And so I think it's not a surprise that it's VPNs. It's definitely not a surprise because VPNs are kind of the dirty secret that you add them in for security, but they actually introduce more vulnerabilities, and they've been involved in a ton of breaches. The CVEs are fairly old, 2018, 2019, 3 of them, one of them was 2020. So none of that should be a surprise. What's different is that people are becoming more bold in the attribution. And I think this is a long time coming. We've been talking about it for a decade. People used to be very uncomfortable with the idea of attribution and how fuzzy it is and how can you ever get to the truth and what if you misattribute. Now it's not so much the problem. And I think it's definitely fair, to say that it's Russia. I think the evidence is in, and overwhelming evidence. We've gotten much better at finding out who the source of the attacks are actually coming from.
Can you expand a little bit more about the VPNs being less good as they are being, we are told they are? What is the danger with them that you're seeing tying into this story?
Well, the overpromise of a VPN is that if you add it in, then you get more security, but actually you can end up doing a lot of damage. And this goes way back to the beginning of VPN. Like you can open up your network by connecting it to a virtual private network. You can have dual hosting, dual homing. You can have The VPN itself is trafficking network over infrastructure you don't own through someone else's infrastructure that's watching. So it introduces sometimes as many security risks as it resolves. And I think in some of the biggest cases, I don't know if I can name names here, but in some of the big retailers that were breached, there was a lot of open VPNs that they weren't able to manage the identities on properly. So they gave people a lot of VPN access that were on rotating, like 40, 50,000 people would be on rotating VPN accounts, and they didn't keep track of those properly. So not the best management. Yeah.
It's a perpetual labyrinth. That's fantastic. It's fascinating. So sort of relating to that, we've got some news from Clubhouse, the new kid on the block here. Apparently the personal data of a number, 1.3 million Clubhouse users was leaked. And this was said to not be major leaks, but just names and social media profiles. Clubhouse has since responded by saying that they have not experienced a breach of their systems and saying this data is publicly available and that it can be accessed via their API. So what should we make about this? The fact that this kind of data, which again is not specific like a social insurance number, but is still good fertile material perhaps for social engineering, the fact that it was accessible through their API, is that something to be concerned about or just par for the course?
It's just such a huge concern. I mean, Clubhouse to me has some of the biggest clown shoes in the industry. They should probably start a circus. I've started calling them doghouse. They've been just so bad about security. And in fact, I wouldn't think anyone who cares about security would even be on Clubhouse at this point. When you say that you're a private Clubhouse and you're only invite only in the platform, and then you go around and just say anyone can see anything through the API, who cares? It's all public information. It's just cognitive dissonance. It's like so incoherent to me that they're trying to play both sides of that card. It reminds me of card systems in 2005 that said, hey, it's not a breach. We didn't have a firewall. I mean, you're breached. You leaked information that you otherwise wouldn't have wanted to leak. And saying it's an API is an incoherent response to me. It's like being an API doesn't change anything, whether it's human or whether it's computer.
Yeah, there does seem to be a little bit, not only with this particular story, but others as well, saying, well, that it wasn't us, that was out there, and it's not our problem. I mean, I think that the LinkedIn story from last week was similar to that it wasn't necessarily a breach, but it was information, and there's a lot of some gray areas happening in terms of culpability and actually what's being lost here and how.
Yeah. So it's a breach of trust, if nothing else.
Indeed. And if we go back a couple more weeks, there was it MobiKwik, the Indian financial transaction company that reacted really badly when it mentioned that they had been had an attack and a breach, and their PR was not exactly fantastic about this. So there's an interesting change in the way I think that these companies are not so much accepting culpability or the sort of the accountability they had in the past. And again, I'm not naming names either, but there seems to be a bit of a shift here as these things happen so often. And this allows us to move into our next story, which is one that I'm quite fascinated by, which is OpponentOwned, because this has been growing over the years as I think a substantially powerful influencer in the industry. So one of these exploits that was shown off at OpponentOwned this year was a remote code execution vulnerability for Zoom on Windows and Mac, on the windows of their Zoom chat, not so much the meetings and video, but the Zoom chat. So this was, I'm not wanting to talk so much about Zoom here, but what are your thoughts about the influence of OpponentOwned now on the industry? I mean, the prize money is getting bigger, the teams are getting way more sophisticated. It's turning into kind of like what Burning Man was and what Burning Man became. What are your thoughts about it?
I used to go to the original OpponentOwned. I used to go to those conferences and stuff. It has changed. It's professionalized in a lot of ways, and it's impressive what people are doing. I'm not a fan of bounties. I'll just come out and say that. I'm not a big fan of the bug bounties. I don't like the economics of them, but I think they've become a necessary evil. And part of that, you can't separate Zoom from the story because they're not really being fair. They haven't really, the FTC went after them for being unfair, for being overstating their abilities. I've started calling Zoom as doom because that was actually the story in April of 2020, and 2021 to have even worse security than you did after an FTC order and after all the news of 2020. It's just a disaster. Anybody who cares about security should not be on Zoom either. Zoom, Clubhouse, forget about it. Don't be on those platforms. And OpponentOwned, I think, is a very good way to, if nothing else, you got to take it to the main stage and show them, what you can do to take them down again.
Wow, that's some interesting words and some fighting words there, which I think is always great to hear. So thanks for that. We're going to take a moment here and introduce our sponsor for today. And our sponsor is Sonatype. With so many issues going around with regards to the control of cloud-native software development lifecycle, including third-party open source code, first-party source code, infrastructure as a code, and containerized code. These are the kinds of things that Sonatype is able to deliver to assist in the kind of protection that people need in terms of software supply chain management. So we are very happy to have them as a sponsor this week, and for more information, you can always go to sonatype.com. So we're coming back now for story number 5. Kind of like Mambo number 5 here. We've got cyberattacks have now been recognized by the Fed chair as the #1 threat to the global financial system. On 60 Minutes last week, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said that cyberattacks are now the foremost risk to the global financial system, even more so than the lending and liquidity risks that led to the 2008 financial crisis. And he cited examples of large firms losing the ability to track payments they are dispersing. Now, this again sounds just like the standard kind of economic environment in which they work. So does it help, David, to have someone of this level make these kinds of statements? Are they driving us down the right path, or is this a red flag type issue? How does his participation in this statement help or hinder our progress?
Yeah, I think it actually helps. I mean, in the way politics works, people don't just jump out on a limb like I am and saying, crazy things. They wait for a while, and so they say things once they know it's safe to do so. So the air is probably clear to say that cyber attacks are the most important thing. However, I think it totally overstates the significance relative to things like lack of diversity or systemic racism in the financial system. So if you really want to talk about, lack of or broad swaths of the financial system being unavailable, talk about, whether Black people can get loans, talk about whether mortgages are being fairly or houses are being fairly assessed. That's probably a bigger issue in the financial liquidity market to me than it is, a cyber attack would take down parts of the financial sector. So they need to think about the racism more than they do about cyber attacks.
That's a very interesting point. It's sort of the curious case of the dog in the night, the one that's not barking, and perhaps just being overly sort of clear on the things that are kind of obvious. So it's interesting to sort of see that there is more interaction and participation with regards to acknowledging technology in the economy at this point in time. But I think you're quite right. There's a few things that were not mentioned that could have been. So moving on to something that is more sort of item specific. CSO Online magazine released a list of 7 social engineering techniques on the rise in 2021 that have been compiled from some industry experts here. I just wanted to just read this list briefly to you, just to ask you what you think is the most dangerous or the most intriguing of these 7 new threats. We've got malicious QR codes being used. We've got the hacking of that allow this site to send you notifications dialog box thingy. We have to say yes or no to when we visit somewhere new. We have the requests for collaborations on projects using Visual Studio files primarily. We've got supply chain partner impersonation, vendor email compromise attacks, which of course is the heart of the SolarWinds type attack. Deep fakes, face or voice deep fakes. We've got fraudulent text SMS messages, and finally typo squatting or lookalike domains as the 7 they've identified. Which do you think is most intriguing or the most dangerous of this collection?
Well, first, let me just say I hate QR codes. I think you could probably have character recognition on URLs and it would be just as effective and people could still read them. The obfuscation of QR codes is stupid to me. And I've run into this with restaurants trying to get me to scan some QR code. I'm like, no way. I think the rest seem like there's nothing really new there. The notification hijack is something we talked about in 2012 in our book that we published. Fake legal threats and fake Zoom apps didn't even make the list, but those seem fairly important. We'll probably talk about those later. Deepfakes is maybe the most interesting to me because of the power shift. I think that I like to frame it as, are you afraid a Black woman would be speaking to you through the appearance of Tom Cruise? Because it makes people re-register what it is they're actually afraid of. If it's that, people who are disenfranchised can actually have a voice now because somebody's using a deepfake to speak in the language or appearance of somebody that they would trust, then that's a different issue than the actual issue of deepfakes, which is, for a lot of people, which is that somebody can be faked without their authorization. But what if they're doing it with authorization? Is it still a risk? That's the most interesting one to me, because I don't think deepfakes are that much of a risk when you really think about it.
No, it is quite fascinating how good they are becoming. I mean, the Tom Cruise one from a few weeks back, I think, sort of woke up a lot of people to this idea. But again, you add another interesting vector to that in terms of people of different.
Yeah, I mean, they're good. Physical appearance is good, but who cares about physical appearance? If I'm blind, you can deepfake me all day and I can't see. So what difference does it make? I'm still going to listen to your voice. So I think people are over-rotating and over-concerned about deepfakes being so meaningful when people shouldn't have thought so much about, the white man. Tom Cruise is talking to them. Well, he's an actor. He's a fake anyway. So, that's his job, is to be an actor. So they shouldn't worry about it as much as they do.
Fair enough. Absolutely. So we've got the FBI now. This is an interesting story that's just developing. Well, it's just coming out. More details are coming out today. In March, Microsoft released some patches for some vulnerabilities that were actively being exploited by Hafnium, apparently anyway, and they were exploiting vulnerabilities to install web shells that gave them access to target networks. So Tuesday, the U.S. Department of Justice announced that it received approval from the court in Houston to copy and remove the web shells from hundreds of Microsoft Exchange mail servers. By accessing, so what they did is they accessed them and issued a command to the servers to remove them, but it's only removed the web shells and didn't remove any other malware that might have been installed through this. So does this make sense to you as a procedure? Is there, again, more stuff going on here? It sounds like an incomplete story to me. I just wonder what your take is on this.
Well, I'm going to sound like a broken record now, but when you talk about Iran having a cyber attack, when you talk about the threats to the financial system, being cyber, these sound like stories out of the 1980s to me. And when we get to this one, it's the same thing. I'm like, in 2012, we gave a presentation in Europe about how we should be doing this. We should be going into people's systems and patching them and fixing them. It was a main stage 2012 presentation. So 10 years later, we're actually doing it. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what should have been happening and probably even longer ago. The idea that people can have their systems destroyed or harmed and police can show up or an authority can show up and help them, Good Samaritan even, just seems logical to me. So I don't think anything's changed here except we're actually doing the stuff we've talked about since forever. If nothing else, what's shocking to me is that Bill Gates' charities aren't donating money to the United States government to help eradicate Microsoft bugs. They care so much about malaria, but not so much about the Microsoft bugs that they themselves were involved with.
So this 10-year lag, do you see that shortening at all, or is this sort of the standard that things do take a decade before they become actionable?
I think there's two things there. There's cycles, there's ups and downs. Some things become less important, some things become more important. And there's a sort of a wave. It goes back and forth and back and forth. And the second thing is politics. So when it becomes politically acceptable to talk about these things, then people come out and say them. So I think the FBI moving forward on this is really, really good because it's become politically acceptable, but it's also become something that's at the forefront of people's minds, patching again. It went away for a while and now it's back.
Cool. Okay. So talking about things sort of going away and coming back again. We've got IcedID looking to fill the malware void that Emotet had left behind. And this is now, again, this has been around since 2017, but as a banking Trojan, we're now seeing this as the sort of the lead product in the malware as a service industry. There's a surge of IcedID activity as Emotet sort of fades away a little bit. So this looks like it's also becoming part of the increasing sophistication of the malware actors, of course, and Microsoft issuing warnings about their malware spam campaigns, especially around things like COVID-19 warnings and so forth. So they're seeing the big guys like Revil using this quite a lot. So this is, again, an eternal procession. You stamp out one and another one comes up in its place, kind of like insects on the floor. Is there anything else you see in your eye in terms of how this eternal procession of one replacing the other can in any way be offset in the future?
Well, the cycle here to me is that organized crime basically is caught up to the early 2000s where they're able to do like the remote computer management. And so that's what they're doing, is trying to embed themselves and then have remote access so they can sort of implant things, which is like remote install software. It's what everybody wanted in 1998, 2000 timeframe. So the fact that organized crime is doing the same thing that system administrators have dreamed about doesn't surprise me. It's just a question of who's authorized and who isn't. It begs the zero trust debate, which is, should we have any perimeters? Should we believe in perimeters? Because, if every system has to be treated as though it can be attacked and controlled and managed individually, there's no safe place, then you get to the whole zero trust. That's the beachhead attack, essentially. I'm not a fan of the zero trust. I haven't written it up yet, but basically I think that there are safe places. We're going to have zones. Again, back to the Iran attack, right? They attacked the electricity because they couldn't get to the centrifuges, so they went to the supply chain. Right. So I think that's what's going on here, is that you have large, I hate to say Russians, but when I look at the map, I see that the hotspots are Germany, United States, Eastern United States. I think that there's sort of a political bent to this as well, but that's basically the cycle that we're seeing, is people want a particular feature for good, and then eventually the bad guys figure out how to get that same feature to do the same sort of things, but without authorization. And then it gets political. Who's doing it to whom?
Yeah, and it is amazing. I mean, I never want to sort of like put the bad guys in a good light, but their constant innovation and their constant brilliance in finding even the smallest workarounds of things, I always find is just amazing. It's a relentless, innovative culture. So we just have a couple of minutes left for a couple last stories. It was patched Tuesday this week, and there were 114 patches released, with 2 of them at 9.8 severity on the scale. And Microsoft actually teamed up with the security services to the National Security Agency specifically to urge immediate deployment of these two new fixes because of this high risk of pre-auth code execution attacks without user interaction. These may be wormable. So how serious is it? And is it unprecedented for Microsoft to jump in like this with the NSA for a joint announcement?
Oh, I don't know about the joint announcement precedents, but I think that the announcements actually go back to this. In the beginning, there's all sorts of, it goes back to Ronald Reagan, really, in the CFAA. So again, back in the 80s, a decision about whether it's going to be civilian or government, and who's going to handle patching, who's going to handle announcements, and who's going to handle remediation. NIST was created for this whole purpose, basically, and they at one point screwed it up by giving people fixes that actually bricked the systems. So there's a long, long, long history here. This is an extremely dangerous situation, though, because email has centricity to it as an attack vector. And you shouldn't overlook any email platforms. Just because Exchange is totally opponed doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at the Zimbra exploit. In fact, that came out as an announcement from the NSA as well. There's a CVE on Zimbra. So all of your email systems, all of your communication systems are being targeted now by Russians, apparently. And so you have to first think about that. Second, don't assume cloud is going to do it any better. I can tell you from personal experience inside some of the largest environments in the world, just because you move to cloud does not mean you're going to be safe. So you really got to think about transparency and how you're going to get attestations and use audits to figure out if people are patching on time inside the cloud when you have even less visibility. So,
right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you have, in the space of 20 minutes, shaken the foundations of a number of major brands here, and I thank you for that because it's good. People have to check, double check, and make sure this stuff does make sense. So, out of the stories that we have, which of these was maybe your favorite in terms of a thumbs up or an eye roller? With your extensive wisdom in this particular area of business, which one sticks in your mind as the most interesting?
It's really hard to pick favorites, but I think the Israeli one is probably the most interesting, maybe, if I had to be forced. Just because, we were so afraid to do attribution. We spent so much time arguing about it. The second would be maybe the FBI one, because, going in and patching systems, same thing. People are so afraid, all these arguments against somebody coming in and fixing something for someone else. What would happen if they were kind and courteous like that? So these changes to me are 10 years overdue, and they're awesome. It's glad to see that they're finally happening in the news, but it's also weird because it looks like the Israelis are trying to disrupt a political process, and it looks like the FBI are trying to stop an active attack. And so who knows what's really going to happen? Are they going to stop it? Is it going to be worse because the FBI have access? Is it going to be worse because Israel just gave Iran an excuse to upgrade refine the uranium faster? So it could turn out to be worse than it was before. But we've been asking for these things to happen for a very long time. So I think those are the two most interesting.
It's kind of like living in a Tom Clancy novel, maybe. It's there's just so many interesting things going on. So this is amazing, of course, as I knew it would be, Davi. So where can people find out more about you? Where would you like to guide them to?
Flying Penguin's probably the best. You go to flyingpenguin.com. You can see some of my outlandish thoughts and some of my criticism of these big brands, as you put it.
Excellent. No, I think that's a great idea. So, Davi Ottenheimer, VP of Trust and Digital Ethics at Inrupt, I want to thank you so much for being here on our chat today with the Cybersecurity Headlines Week in Review. I do look forward to speaking with you again. So thank you very much for being with us. And
my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm just going to end this off now by saying, this is a lot of great, interesting stuff to take back and think about seriously, and check out flyingpenguin.com for some more insight that way. This is what we do. We bring this information to you. If you want more right off the bat here, think about joining us tomorrow, our Friday video chat, which is Hacking Cloud Security Myths. That starts at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You can just go to cisoseries.com and click on the Register for Video Chats button. And as for us, we deliver this information every weekday for about a 6-minute podcast, so you can find out what you need as you need it for the beginning and your knowledge for the day. So thank you so much for joining us. We will be back next week. Take care. Stay safe. We'll see you then.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOseries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.